The pontificate of Pope Leo XIV is well underway. Here to reflect on the first week and with analysis of what Pope Leo and the Universal Church will face in the months and years ahead, I'm joined by the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. We are a week into this new pontificate of Leo XIV, and as he gets down to business, he had a few notable audiences this week that I want to explore. Cardinal Sean O'Malley, the former Archbishop of Boston, longtime member of Pope Francis's so-called C9, that council of cardinals who advised him, and the president of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Children and Minors, met with the new pope. And so I want to start there. Bob, give me your thoughts on why do you think he met with Cardinal O'Malley right off the bat? Do you think this had to do with the governance of the Vatican or the protection of children and minors, which has been a challenge under Pope Francis?
Yeah, we're all kind of groping around to figure out what these first initial things that he's doing signify. And you would have to think that because of the prominence of Cardinal O'Malley in protecting victims of abuse, and we know that he even stood up a couple of times, particularly in Chile, for example, to Pope Francis because he thought that he wasn't handling the things well. This is one of the two major issues that is going to be facing the Pope, along with many, many other issues, of course, and it's the abuse crisis and the ongoing crisis of the finances. So it's not surprising that he met with a fellow American, too.
Yeah, and one who has a good lay of the land in Rome. Father, how significant was the other big audience of the week, really right off the bat, with the Moderator General of Opus Dei, Monsignor Fernando de Ocariz? In 2022, Pope Francis issued a motu proprio that sought to modify the structures and governance of Opus Dei, it being a personal prelature. Where does that stand at this moment, and how might Opus Dei be handled differently under Pope Leo?
I think it's significant that the prelate of Opus Dei, so-called either prelate or moderator, was granted an audience. My guess is that the Opus Dei prelate asked for the audience and it was given. He was accompanied by his vicar, Monsignor Fazio. So it's important because Opus Dei has been under, we could say, examination in view of many changes that Pope Francis began with Code of Canon Law. He changed the nature of personal prelatures, which is what Opus Dei is. The Opus Dei used to be under the Congregation for Bishops. Now it's under the Dicastery for Clergy. And Opus Dei has been updating its statutes. In fact, the process has been going on for more than a year. And according to press reports, Opus Dei's proposals have been turned down up to this point by the Vatican. Now, interestingly enough, the day that Pope Francis died, Easter Monday, Opus Dei began its general meeting in Rome with representatives from out the world, and they were going to examine the statutes. Well, they postponed the statute examination in view of waiting for the new pope. So I imagine the prelate of Opus Dei went to talk about that, and Pope Leo has a knowledge of Opus Dei because Peru, Opus Dei is very well known, and in fact, the Diocese of Chiclayo, where he was the bishop, previously had an Opus Dei priest as a bishop. So I think it's very significant, and I hope and pray that Opus Dei will, be given a canonical hearing that will include all the elements that make up the personal prelature and how any changes would have a negative impact on Opus Dei.
Also this week, Pope Leo addressed the Oriental churches, the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church, for the Jubilee of Eastern churches. And he quite beautifully celebrated the Eastern tradition. This is what he said, and I want to explore this. He said, "The Church needs you. The contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense. We have great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. It is vital, then, that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them for the sake, perhaps, of practicality or convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism and utilitarianism. Father, your thoughts on Pope Leo's celebration of the beauty and mystery of the Eastern Rite liturgies, and what might that indicate about the treatment of the traditional Latin Mass, especially in the wake of Pope Francis's Traditionis Custodes, which suppressed the old rite?
No, I praise Pope Leo for what he said. The Eastern liturgy is beautiful. It's going back, to the beginnings of Christianity in the East, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom being one of the primary liturgies, and it was written by a saint, and it's preserved in its beauty up till this time. All of that is true. Liturgy is meant to bring the soul into contact with God, and God is a mysterious, invisible presence. So the liturgy tries to make visible and sensible those elements of mystery. That's exactly why people have been asking the Holy See to continue to allow the traditional Latin Mass to be celebrated without restrictions or even its suppression, as Pope Francis made clear he was interested that everybody go to the new Mass. So I think this is a good sign for those who like the traditional Latin Mass, and I would say the whole Church should learn that having different liturgies is a way to express in common our search for God and God's coming to us in mystery through worship.
Bob, I want you to comment on that, and then I'm going to add this. I mean, that bit about attenuating, don't attenuate your traditions. I mean, that to me would indicate that he has a reverence for these traditions and the supernatural power of the traditional Mass.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly seems to even have emerged in the way that he's been conducting himself during his own celebration of liturgies. Look, I wrote a column just this week that my most emotional moment in Rome the past couple of weeks is when I went to in Italian, a Byzantine Rite Catholic Mass at Santa Maria in Trastevere. I mean, it was just utterly otherworldly. And as wonderful as the emotion was in St. Peter's when the Pope was elected, this was really something. I mean, this really touched me very deeply as well. And I noticed in the conversation, in the discourse that he offered to the representatives of the Eastern Church, that he used an Augustinian phrase. There's a famous phrase of Augustine where he talks about beauty, ever ancient, ever new. And he used that phrase when he talked about the depth of spirituality that the Eastern tradition has been able to preserve. And its importance because it comes from a church that very often, because it was behind the Iron Curtain, because it's been dealing with militant Islam, has survived through suffering and yet has brought this great beauty and depth. And we need it. We need it very desperately in the West.
You bet. Yeah, and Bob, I mean, you leaned into the next part of what I wanted to ask you. During that address to the Latin, or Eastern rites rather, Pope Leo implored Christians in these often war-torn regions not to leave their lands despite the violence surrounding them. Bob, you've got a new book on martyrdom out now, which is an incredible read. We've addressed that shrinking population in those ancient communities for years. How significant is this focus of Pope Leo on the persecuted Christians this early in his pontificate?
Well, I want to say his election displaced my promotion of the book in Rome last week, which was originally the reason why I was supposed to go over there. But of course, I noticed that because I had just written this book. It just came out last month. And what he's asking is actually for heroism and holiness, because if you read about the conditions of Christians in these historic Christian communities that go all the way back to the first days of the church, I mean, St. Paul on the road to Damascus, that's one of the most famous episodes in the early part of the church. And millions of these Christians have been leaving. Bethlehem, where our Lord was born, has been greatly reduced in the number of Christians there. So for him to say, don't leave, and be brave in your circumstances is really to call not just for holiness but for heroism. And he's also been working previously with Aid to the Church in Need, which supported the book that I just wrote, which has been trying to rebuild communities in the Middle East in particular and encourage people to come back. So I think we're going to see more of that. For the fact that he raised that up right now at the beginning, I think that that's a significant moment.
Father, something Pope Leo did not mention in his address to the Eastern churches was synodality, nor was it mentioned in his audience with journalists, which we'll get to in a moment. But the Vatican's synodal office made a grand pledge to support Pope Leo, noting that, quote, the synodal journey continues under his leadership. Your thoughts on Pope Leo's omission of synodality in these two meetings, despite his early mention, and what do you make of the push from the old synod guard here?
Well, it's hard to read into silence, whether it's because he had other important things to say and didn't want to bring that up, or if he was intentionally leaving it aside. We really can't interpret the tea leaves on that. He did mention synodality both in his remarks from the lodge or the balcony when he was elected, and then he mentioned it also in the Mass he celebrated in the Sistine Chapel with the cardinals. What remains to be seen, of course, is how he understands synodality, because synodality is largely an undefined term. You know, if we look at it historically, as we've discussed on this program, synodality goes all the way back to the apostles. It means meetings of bishops. And then Paul VI, following Vatican II, established the Synod of Bishops as an institution, not part of the not part of the Roman Curia, but attached to it in a sense, which was to bring bishops from out the world to Rome to talk about current problems. Pope Francis took it in an entirely new direction, where he made it basically a meeting of every category of the baptized to kind of come together with the Pope and figure out what to do, but thereby diminishing the importance of bishops and then confusing roles. So I'm not sure what Pope Leo's understanding of synodality is. My hope and prayer is that he will restore what Vatican II intended, which is that the Synod of Bishops is a Synod of Bishops, and that the input of laity and others, such as priests, deacons, and religious, that's all advisory. It's not determinative, because bishops alone are the shepherds.
Yeah, this will tell us the direction of this pontificate and, which way he's tending, this definition of synodality. Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, the Relator General of the Synod on Synodality under Pope Francis, weighed in this week when asked about Pope Leo and what he might do about fiducia supplicans. That's the document Pope Francis issued allowing the blessings of same-sex couples. Hollerich said this: about fiducia supplicans, I hypothesize that the new pope could reinterpret but not abolish it. By the way, the Church does not intend to equate same-sex unions with marriage. In fact, the declaration places the emphasis on the fact that every person is blessed by God. Bob, your thoughts on the Cardinal's assessment there? Hollerich also acknowledged that Pope Leo follows in Francis's footsteps.
Yeah, I think that's an expression of a pious wish on the part of the Cardinal, because everything we know about Leo is that he's been strongly opposed to what he calls gender, recognizing genders that don't exist, and the soft way in which same-sex couples are somehow, it's not, they're not equated, but it's kind of implied that they're on the same glide path, so to speak, as heterosexual couples. So I'd be very surprised, actually, if he doesn't take a much more robust step about fiducia supplicans. Whether he will repudiate that document outright, which I think he ought to do, by the way, it's hard to say. But one of the things where I think all of us are noting about him right away is he really speaks in clear terms. We're not any longer in this game of ambiguity and saying yes, but not entirely yes, and no, but not entirely no. I think he speaks his mind forthrightly, because that's the kind of person that he is. And it will be interesting to see, if he does turn to that document, how he handles it.
Yeah. Father, during and following the conclave, a story surfaced that claimed that there was some kind of agreement between the current Pope and Cardinal Raymond Burke and traditional-minded cardinals. I got into it on the Arroyo Grande podcast this week with Vatican journalist Diane Montagna. Listen.
There is a major story out there that Pope Leo, then Cardinal Prevost, attended a meeting at Cardinal Raymond Burke's apartment before the conclave. I have spoken to about 7 sources about this. 3 of them confirmed to me, both very close, all 3 of them very close to both sources here, parties here, who tell me that meeting never happened. One said it was an out-and-out fabrication. Yes. Your take on this?
No, it never happened. I have it on the best of sources that meeting never happened. There were a lot of cardinals speaking before the conclave, and the mere fact that cardinals were having meetings should not be something that bothers us, whether it's the progressives, the center, the right. That's the normal thing to do. What would we expect the cardinals to do when they haven't met for so long? accept, come together and meet and talk. That's perfectly natural. But this rumor going around, the Cardinal Prevost had gone to Cardinal Burke's apartment and that they had spoken, it's completely false.
If you want to fully understand the conclave and the movements that led to the election of Pope Leo, visit Arroyo Grande's show on YouTube. This episode on Pope Leo's path to the papacy is worth watching. You should subscribe anyway. Our Posse episodes are also on fire. Go to RaymondArroyo.com for the links. Father, why do you think stories like this were so ubiquitous? I mean, were they created to kind of calm traditionalist fears? What was this?
Well, I think this is part of the journalistic frenzy during the conclave. Since they, don't have any microphones in the Sistine Chapel, everybody's got to try to identify, well, what do the tea leaves tell us about what happened before they went in? So making assertions about who saw who, promises. Both Pope Leo and Cardinal Burke are canon lawyers, and they know that it's forbidden to make promises for provision of jobs and the like, before voting for someone to be pope. Now, it's quite clear that the cardinals have an interest in knowing what each of them thinks, so asking questions at the general congregations or at other settings is fine. But, yeah, the idea that he was seen going into the building where Cardinal Burke lives, this has been debunked, and we shouldn't imply any sinister motives to Cardinal Burke or to Pope Leo because they're both honest men, and they're, going to do what they think is right.
Father, that canon lawyer point is an important one as well. Pope Leo also took aim at what he called polarizing language when meeting with the world's journalists. He said, in today's media culture, we need a calmer tone in communication. Here's what he said: let us disarm words and we will help to disarm the world. Disarmed and disarming communication allows us to share a different view of the world and to act in a manner consistent with our human dignity. Bob, he seems very conscious of the media and this media environment, certainly aware of the effect of rhetoric in the public discourse.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is that at the same time, he doesn't give you the impression that he's trying to implement some kind of media strategy or he's being manipulative. Again, I think he's speaking from that Augustinian heart of who he actually is. And he would like us to, maybe this gives us an indication of where he's going to go with synodality, because obviously there's been a lot of heated rhetoric about what's going on in synodality. And for people to really make any kind of progress about contested issues, they have to be willing to be sincerely there to listen and to learn from one another. It's a very difficult thing to do. We know that in the secular world, the world is just going absolutely crazy, not only here, but in other developed nations as well. It's a difficult thing at this moment. And the church itself, let's be frank about this, is itself very deeply divided the way that the secular world is. And we're passing into a new moment. And I'm interested, I'm going to myself be paying attention to the way that he's drawn some parallels with Leo XIII, where he thought that Leo XIII had noticed a revolution that was taking place at the end of the 19th century. He sees one taking place in 2025, a different type of revolution, but nonetheless one that needs to be managed.
Yeah. Among the major challenges facing Pope Leo as he embarks on this pontificate is the Vatican's dire financial situation. Numerous reports show that the Vatican faces a budget deficit of around 94 million, but I've seen it much higher than that, and a pension fund imbalance estimated to be between $600 and $700 million unfunded. According to a Reuters report just before Francis was admitted to the hospital in February, Pope Francis was facing strong resistance from senior cardinals when he pushed for budget cuts. Father, what might he do, Pope Leo, to curb some of these expenses? Let's start with papal nunciatures, which cost the Vatican about 41 million euros back in 2021.
Well, this is a big issue for the Holy See because the extent of its activities is worldwide, but its source of revenue has shrunk and it is not adequate to fund what the current obligations are. Now, nunciatures are important because the Pope sends nuncios, bishops throughout the world, and they are the ambassadors to the secular government of the country where they are, but they're also the representative of the Pope to the hierarchy of each nation. So each episcopal conference, each country, that's how the Pope communicates with them. And the nuncios, most critically, are the ones who compile lists for new bishops to be assigned in the country they're responsible for. Now, you can save money by combining some nunciatures, which they already do. There are many smaller countries which have one nuncio for, let's say, 4, 5, or 6 different countries. But it's important to know that nunciatures in certain countries where the interest of defending the church is paramount, where you might have persecution going on or a government that is seeking, to curb the influence of the church, having a nuncio present really makes the Holy Father present on behalf of all Christians. So this is an area they should do some careful study and figure whether cost savings would unfortunately hamper the mission of the Holy See, or they can reconcile those two things.
Yeah. Bob, the Dicastery of Communications, which is kind of shocking, that's the biggest portion of the Vatican's budget, 43 million euros in 2021, just that year. Your reaction to that, and what might they do to streamline those operations?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were all shocked when we saw those numbers come out because, as we've said many times, it doesn't seem like the communications in the Vatican are particularly well handled. There are even between different parts of the Vatican, there often doesn't seem to be very good communication. I think even Francis, if I'm remembering this right, was talking about paring back Vatican radio. Is it really effective? Yeah. I mean, I'd be sorry to see it go. I remember as a kid, I think, listening to Vatican radio in Latin and thinking how wonderful it was that, this language that hardly anybody knows is being broadcast to the world. But there too, when you have deficits like this and you have obligations like they're looking at, you may not want to go into Doge mode inside the Catholic Church, but there are only 2 ways to solve this. And one is to raise more money, which no doubt Leo is going to be doing, and he probably will be leaning on us in the United States more than in the past. And you have to cut costs. And this has to be serious. Pope Francis started out with some serious attempts to reform the finances in the Vatican. He put in structures. He brought in Cardinal Pell, for example. But then things didn't seem to go anywhere. And as often happens in the Vatican, it just kind of fell apart. People were fired. People were thrown out of offices. That's an unfinished business that needs to be taken up, and soon.
Yeah. He started a committee, I know, Pope Francis, I think it was last year, a sort of donation committee. But that's usually the last refuge, when things get really dire, the fundraisers start coming in. When I think, at least in terms of the church, if you're giving people the truth and you're doing it in a winsome, exciting way, that money naturally comes in. You don't have to push it. Mother Angelica just said, keep us between your gas and electric bill. That was her fundraising apparatus. It worked. Gents, I want to talk about the atmosphere in Rome at the dawn of this new pontificate. Archbishop Georg Ganswein, who was Pope Benedict and Pope Francis's former personal secretary, told Corriere della Sera that Pope Leo, quote, has started well. Now a new phase begins. I sense a certain widespread relief. The season of arbitrariness is over. We can begin to count on a papacy capable of guaranteeing stability and relying on existing structures without overturning or disrupting them, end quote. Father, how has the tone in Rome and in the Vatican changed? What are you hearing?
No, I think Bishop Ganswein makes a very good point, and you've got to recall that he was a victim of what I consider to be an arbitrary decision on Pope Francis's part. Pope Francis removed him as head of the prefect of the papal household, which is his prerogative, but then he forbid him to live in Rome. He didn't give him an assignment, but ordered him to vacate his apartment in Rome and go back to Regensburg, his diocese. I believe that was diocese. When he would go back to the diocese, he had no assignment there. And he languished in that position for at least 6 months or more. Now, God bless Pope Francis, because then he made him a nuncio, and he's currently holding that role in Lithuania. But remember, Cardinal Burke's salary was cut off because Pope Francis said that he was a source of disunity. These kind of actions shocked everybody in the Roman Curia. And then recall what he said once in a meeting with the Curia. He said there were a lot of leprous courtiers working in the Curia. Which is really a slam word kind of usage. And, you say to yourself, well, if they're leprous courtiers, remove them, don't keep people like that around. But he didn't do that. So it's sort of like, being nasty to the people who work for him, but then leaving him in place. I think that's all going to end right now, has ended, because from all appearances and from his, previous media appearances, this is a very reasonable, soft-spoken, listening man. In fact, that's one thing I like to highlight. Everybody I'm reading says that Pope Leo, when he was the bishop and missionary, listened to people. That's the place to start if you want to restore social harmony in the Holy See.
Yeah. Bob, in Germany, Bishop Franz Joseph Overbeck is saying the rise of Leo could dampen hopes of reform in Germany. Your reaction to that?
Well, it all depends on what you mean by reform, doesn't it? If he means that it's likely to dampen hopes of a radical separation from the universality of the rest of the Catholic Church, yeah, there may be some threats to that. But I would hope that that Pope Leo is going to bring some fresh energies to that situation. Look, we have talked about this before on the show. Francis was very harsh toward at least the people who worked for him were very harsh toward the traditional Latin Mass. Meanwhile, there's a much more radical, schismatic possibility coming out of Germany. And so something needs to be seriously done about that. And otherwise, we're going to have another split in Germany like the previous Reformation. I mean, we can't have one church in which homosexuality is being blessed, there are women priests and women deacons, etc., and another in which the rules are entirely different. I think that's going to be a hard thing for Leo to take on. But he's the kind of guy, you rightly say, who he gives you this impression, and I think that this is also interesting about him. He gives you an impression of a guy who listens, but at the same time, he's his own man. And he isn't harsh in the way he responds. He seems to have charmed a lot of the bishops he came in contact with when he was the head of the dicastery for bishops. And that may have had some effect on why it was that he was elected. But there's both strength there and a kind of openness. And that, to me, is a very interesting and an attractive combination.
I'm told by some cardinals and bishops who are close to him that he apparently went through the blades when he was working at the dicastery for bishops for the last couple of years, because many of the suggestions he made, many of the candidates for bishop that he offered Pope Francis were kind of dismissed summarily. And I think he's very aware of what precedes him and what the remedy might be in these days that he has certainly much more control and influence over. Finally, a bipartisan group of lawmakers led by West Virginia Republican Riley Moore is introducing a resolution to officially congratulate Pope Leo XIV on his historic election as the first American pope. And Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife, as well as Secretary Marco Rubio and his spouse, will lead the U.S. delegation to Pope Francis's inaugural Mass on May 18th. Gents, very quickly, your thoughts on the American response thus far to this first American pope. It is incredible.
This is remarkable, Raymond. We have an American pope. You know, the Catholic Church in the United States was originally a missionary church, and now we've become, the supplier to the world of the first American pope. So it's a great honor for our country. It's a great honor for, Pope Leo's parents and all of his ancestors who remain faithful to the church. I'm glad that the United States government is making this effort to recognize the uniqueness of this situation. The important thing, of course, is that the people of the United States need to know that the Catholic religion teaches that God is sovereign over the whole world. Therefore, the Pope represents God in the world, and we need to remind people of that. God does rule over all nations, including our own. So under God, we have to obey his law, and we have to be a light and a beacon of hope and charity for the world. That's the important thing we need to keep in mind.
Yeah. Bob, very quickly, almost out of time.
Yeah, and I think that that's what the Pope has already been emphasizing, that and it's that deep Augustinianism that he has in himself. He clearly is emotionally attached to the United States, to Latin America. He spent time in Italy. He speaks 5 different languages, but he can communicate very easily. But it's wonderful that at this moment in our own tumultuous time here in America, that we've got an American Pope, we've got a delegation going over there, and I can't wait for him to come here.
All right, we will leave it there and await that moment. For commentary from Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, visit thecatholicthing.org. Thank you, gents. We'll check in with you soon.